Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. We begin the second half of the lecture series today by turning our attention to the ongoing war in Ukraine. In February of 2022, Russian forces invaded its western neighbor. The aim was to knock out the capital city very quickly and then ultimately absorb the entire country, make it part of Russia. Back in 2014, Russia captured the Crimean Peninsula without firing a shot. It then began to provide material support for separatist rebels on the eastern half of Ukraine in their war with the national military. While Ukraine is very far from American shores and frankly not even very close to Western Europe, it is on the doorstep of NATO because of that alliance's enlargement following the Cold War's end. Back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union dominated all of Eastern Europe, and NATO, of course, countered it with its military alliance. When the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in 1991, it created 14 brand new countries in addition to the Russian Federation. NATO took full advantage, welcoming former Soviet bloc countries like Poland and Hungary into the alliance, and even admitting former Soviet republics, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, into the alliance. Beyond that, NATO expanded, not by membership but operation, into regions far and wide, including anti-terror operations throughout Africa. When the Cold War ended, the line dividing East from West, NATO from the Soviet bloc, was drawn down the heart of Europe. That expanded over the years, including recent admissions in the form of Finland and Sweden as a result of this conflict. But as NATO marched eastward, it put two countries in particular in the crosshairs. Because when the Soviet Union no longer dominated Eastern Europe, and the old balance of power that had previously existed in Europe was gone, suddenly Belarus and Ukraine became prime areas of competition. If NATO could add them to the fold, they would have the entire Western front of Russia hemmed in. Therefore, they needed to remain neutral or on Russia's side in Moscow's calculation. As the Biden administration talked openly about admitting Ukraine into NATO, authorizing joint military operations in the country, Russia felt it had no choice but to go to war and prevent the loss of Ukraine. This, of course, doesn't justify the invasion, but it gives us a better understanding of what Vladimir Putin was thinking. So why does this invasion really matter? Well, aside from the death and destruction, which has been significant, this significantly diverts our attention from other issues on the agenda with Russia and the rest of the world. This has effectively taken the oxygen out of the room. We can't talk about any matter with Russia other than the ongoing war in Ukraine. Not trade talks, environmental regulation, arms control, or global stability. There's also the very real threat that this conflict could escalate. Many of the Russian missiles do fly near, if not inside, of NATO airspace, and it's very possible that at one point a missile or two will go sideways and actually do real damage in a NATO country. It also violates a cardinal rule of world politics, one that we've used since 1945 to stabilize the international system. It is embodied in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, which we, the Soviets and the Brits, drafted. It makes borders sacrosanct. There can be no invasion that results in a change of borders or change of territorial possession. So the Americans and the Soviets in 1945, they could not agree on a whole lot, but what they did agree was in their narrow self-interest is that borders are what they are. War is not a legitimate means of changing boundaries. If you think about all of the wars that have taken place since 1945, by some estimates, some 285 of them, only a small handful have been territorial wars designed to change boundaries. The Korean War, without question. Korea wanted to unify under the North through the use of military force. Several of the Arab-Israeli wars have been about changing boundaries, either for the Arab states or for Israel. And some of the India-Pakistan wars have resulted in changed boundaries. All of the others, however, have been political statements. We're trying to gain leverage, change leadership abroad, or alter the relationship between our countries. But the war that Russia is fighting in Ukraine is a territorial aggrandizement war. It wants to change the boundary and extend Russia deep into the areas now controlled by Ukraine. This has been a slow unfolding crisis in Eastern Europe, beginning with some nibbling by Russia back in 2008. It invaded Georgia, not surprisingly, when the Bush administration was talking openly about Georgia joining NATO. That is a cause for war for Russia. And while this war was a political statement, the Russians got in, they got out quickly, they sent their message to Georgia and to the Western world that that country is not joining NATO. They did hold on to some territories. They made territorial claims in South Ossetia, which is largely populated by Russian-speaking citizens of Georgia, and the larger region of Abkhazia.
Russians view them as countrymen. They don't really believe in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Certainly, ethnic Balts in the Baltic states don't see it that way.
As mentioned earlier, Crimea was taken by Russia in 2014. Additionally, Russia began to prod into the eastern portions of Ukraine in an effort to push their boundary to the west, with a conflict that was relatively low level in intensity. So how did we respond to 2008, 2014, and Russian actions in eastern Ukraine, economic sanctions? They were very slow in implementation and very limited in impact. We protested diplomatically, we denounced those acts of aggression, and we expelled a number of Russian diplomats. We also provided material assistance to Ukraine in the form of more advanced military capabilities.
Putin decided to take action and stop Georgia's closer cooperation with NATO and the European Union. So they decided to advance and create turmoil in the former Soviet Republic.
The West was basically looking at its shoes as he conducted this invasion, and he mistakenly assumed that he could do the same thing in eastern Ukraine, and there he was surprised by Ukrainian resistance.
So Russia is now calculating, all right, we nibbled a bit in 2008, in 2014, and thereafter. The results were sanctions that were manageable. We can survive them. The thinking then is that we, if invade Ukraine and defeat it very, very quickly, the result will be more manageable sanctions, will ultimately be okay. Russian aims were pretty clear. They wanted to conquer all of Ukraine. Instead, they find themselves in what very soon will be a 4-year stalemate. They wanted to end NATO enlargement. Instead, 2 new countries joined NATO as a direct result of this invasion, and they wanted to weaken the Western world in general, weaken NATO in particular. Today, NATO is probably stronger than it's ever been. So a wholesale failure in calculations in Moscow.
I always call that the mother of all unintended consequences for Russian strategic thinking. If Russia had one objective with Sweden and Finland, it was to keep them outside of the alliance, and by Russia's full-scale invasion, now we are part of NATO.
Big picture, Russia wanted to reassert itself as a major player in world politics. The reality is that Vladimir Putin made Russia an isolated rogue state. So what happened? Why did such a large, powerful country that started this war fail so miserably? It did what many political leaders do. It overestimated its own strength while simultaneously underestimating the strength of its adversary. It gravely miscalculated the NATO resolve, and the speed at which we would respond.
NATO will coordinate the training of the Ukrainian forces at facilities in allied countries and provide support to the long-term development of Ukraine's forces. Allies have also agreed a major financial pledge to Ukraine with a minimum baseline of 40 billion euros within the next year.
And it also failed to truly understand the nature of warfare. It is so much easier on paper to win a war with a weaker neighbor than to actually pull that off in reality. I think its gravest error and one of the most important lessons to learn from the Russian invasion is the power of cancel culture. Two types of economic sanctions have been applied to Russia. One of them, traditional government sanctions. The United States, France, Italy, Germany, UK, and many others authorized economic sanctions against the country. They've been marginally successful and impactful. Then there are social sanctions. When young people across the world say, I simply will not do business, I will not buy products from any company that operates in Russia, that works in Russia's economy. Those have been overwhelmingly devastating. Major corporations, from automobile manufacturers to Levi Jeans, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, among hundreds if not thousands of others, have gotten wholesale out of the Russian economy. It's just stunning the number of corporations, large and small. Sure, Apple and Amazon, but literally 1,000 others have left Russia, and there's a really good chance they never will return. They spent a small fortune getting into that country. It's already an expensive place to operate. The infrastructure is not that great. The government regulations, the insurance rates make it very hard to be profitable. And now they lose a fortune when they have to withdraw under the pressure of social sanctions. They're probably not going back. Russia's economy is in a world of trouble. It was doing okay before the war began. Many years, the economic growth was 6 to 10%. And then came the war, the sanctions, and a declining economy. And while it has rebounded since 2023, I would call that a sugar high. This is not genuine growth in Russia. This is turning your economy to the war effort, which is highly profitable from a GDP point of view, a lot of economic activity, but it's negative economic activity. You're producing goods that are going to be destroyed on the battlefield very quickly. They don't have long-term benefit for the citizens of your country. Things are getting better for Russia. The 2024 election could not have gone better. No doubt Mr. Putin is very happy that Donald Trump is in the White House. That was certainly on display with that little spat between Donald Trump and Mr. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, in 2025. A very inconsistent level of support from Washington for Ukraine. And then there's the Alaska summit in 2025, where Mr. Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin, signaling to the world he's no longer persona non grata. He's someone that we can and will work with. But things at the same time are getting a lot worse for Russia. The economy is not going to last. There is a pending economic calamity on the horizon for Russia. They just cannot hold out with the current trend line. Inflation rates are in the double digits. The equivalent of their Federal Reserve, their interest rates are over 20%, staving off the inflation that's brought about by that sugar high. Territorial gains in Ukraine are marginal at best. They're gaining a meter here and a kilometer there, but they're not making strong inroads. And Europe's resolve is hardening and stiffening. We're hearing the Germans, the Brits, and the French especially talking about increased levels of military aid and even talk of putting soldiers on the ground if necessary to defend Ukraine's integrity. And Ukraine's getting a whole lot better at fighting the war with Russia. Asymmetric war is always this way. If there's not a quick knockout blow, things follow a predictable pattern. We have a very large professional military, whether it's the United States or Israel or Russia, fighting against a much smaller opponent. The Revolutionary War, exemplary. The Vietnam War. The war in Lebanon, beginning in 1982. In all of these wars, it's pretty simple. The stronger power loses if it does not win. And the weaker power wins if it does not lose. So for the weaker power, just hold on. Don't collapse, don't lose, and you have a real chance of winning this conflict. The learning curve reflects that. Over time, the stronger power will improve its tactics. It will learn, but it does so incrementally. These are large mechanical militaries. They have codes of conduct. They have rules and procedures. Change does not happen quickly. But in smaller, weaker, sometimes less professional militaries who are fighting for their literal survival, the learning curve is very, very steep. And we see that in Ukraine. They have literally revolutionized the use of drones in armed conflict. Wars of the 21st century will be fought differently because of the Russo-Ukrainian War. And these unarmed drones, which are amazingly inexpensive, very easy to use, and extraordinarily effective. They are deadly against soldiers, against groups of soldiers, and against hardened military sites. Just look at the Ukrainian production. In 2024, over 4 million domestically produced drones in Ukraine. And 2025, that number is going up by about 50%. They're produced in country. They're built in or near the front lines. And the Ukrainians are using 3D printers. They don't even need manufacturing centers or hard products. They can do all of this with printers and paper. Operation Spiderweb will go down in history as one of the most cost-effective and impactful drone attacks in warfare. We begin with the drones being assembled in trucks in Ukraine, slipping across the border and positioning themselves next to 5 different Russian military sites. The trucks were opened up. The drones flew on June 1st of 2025, attacking aircraft on 5 bases, 117 drones. They cost a couple $100 each, damaged and destroyed 20 aircraft in the Soviet Air Force. The Russian Air Force. Many were old Soviet airplanes with deep threat capabilities. $7 billion in damage was caused by that one operation. 1/3 of Russia's strategic force was destroyed in one afternoon. Just an amazing accomplishment. The trend line is profoundly negative for the Russian Federation. If this line is the line of success, they break through, they capture the capital, they chase the political leadership, they mop up the rest of the country and absorb it into Russia. They were very close in the spring of 2022. That initial invasion set Ukraine on its heels. They were defending on the run, and Russia was pressing very deep into the country. But the counteroffensive by Ukraine later that year recaptured almost all of the territory that they had lost, and since then, this war's largely been a stalemate on the ground. And with that, Russia's chance of victory continued to slide. They are further away from victory today than they've ever been. And sure, the Russians can keep blowing up apartment buildings. They can keep bombing hospitals and maternity wards. They can cause a lot of pain in Ukraine. There's no question about that. But time and again, they've proven they cannot break through the Ukrainian lines. They can push them back a little, but piercing them, getting some momentum, and plunging deep into Ukraine just is not happening. And think about the cost to Russia. 1 million casualties on the battlefield. Between 200,000 and 300,000 dead Russian soldiers, and the number of generals killed in this war is astronomical. So Russia is paying a very high price just to hang in this bloody stalemate of a war. American foreign policy options. We begin with the spectrum of possibilities on the ground. On one extreme, we have a Russian victory. That means it absorbs all of Ukraine. And on the other end of the spectrum, a Ukrainian victory, which means it pushes Russia out of all Ukrainian territory. In the east, places like Donetsk, and out of the Crimean Peninsula. Our options are then built around those two extremes, but we probably should keep in mind that Russia's not going to win this war, and neither is Ukraine. So our policy is going to unfold basically in three areas. One option, which the Russians would prefer, is that we abandon Ukraine. We can justify this by saying Ukraine is not a traditional ally, is not a member of NATO. It's not even considered a major non-NATO ally. It's a country that we've had relations with, we view as important, but we're not willing to die for. We don't want to risk a general escalation of this conventional war into a Russo-NATO war or perhaps even a nuclear war. So we're going to leave Ukraine to its own devices. Moving a little towards the middle, we support Ukraine to keep it alive, to prevent the Russians from overwhelming it. And then a pro-Ukrainian policy would be to increase that support, give Ukraine all the weapons that it needs, not only to defend its current positions, but to push Russians back on the ground and even attack Russia across the Ukrainian border, in Russia proper. Obviously, the risks vary by each of these broad policy directions. Abandoning Ukraine does have a risk. It might ultimately mean that West Europe becomes embroiled in a war against Russia in Ukraine. Supporting Ukraine is a little more dangerous because that draws the ire of Vladimir Putin and makes the likelihood of his escalating this war even greater. And of course, the highest level of risk is if we give Ukraine the tools that it needs to launch wars deep inside of Russia. Then we can see an unraveling and rapid escalation of this conflict. Trump, a game changer. I mean, that's certainly what he campaigned on in 2024. He pledged to end this war in one day. That obviously has not happened. He also indicated an end to U.S. military aid to Ukraine. That certainly would be a game changer because Ukraine by itself isn't a world of trouble against a larger Russia, but it's always dependent upon NATO's support, and the Americans make up a really big portion of that NATO support. If we were to punch a hole in that calculation by withdrawing all support from Ukraine, what likely happens is that our allies fill the void. They'd rather not because it's really expensive, but France and Britain, Germany and South Korea, they can step things up, provide Ukraine with enough munitions, enough missiles, enough technology to keep them alive in this ongoing war. So how do you convince Donald Trump to change his mind? One way is to make a classic geostrategic argument, something that Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski would make. I don't think that really interests him a whole lot. It certainly isn't in his wheelhouse. It doesn't reflect the sorts of things he thinks about a lot. Make him a business offer. And then Donald Trump becomes quite interested, because at the core, he is a transactional businessman. That's exactly what Mr. Zelensky did. He said to Donald Trump, "We will give you exclusive rights to our rare earth minerals in exchange for American support in our defense against Russia." And that appeared to be a winning strategy. Mr. Zelensky traveled to Washington, D.C. He went to the White House and immediately got into a televised spat with the U.S. president, one that was goaded on by Vice President J.D. Vance, who's probably operating here more on personal political interest, rallying the MAGA base and establishing himself as the logical successor to Donald Trump, than through some complicated foreign policy calculation. It was a humiliation for Mr. Zelensky, and frankly, it was pretty embarrassing for the United States as well. The policy as it unfolds. So Trump declares neutrality. I'm not going to lean either way because the best way to end this war is for a negotiator to be neutral. It makes a lot of sense. He then dresses down Zelensky publicly, which indicates he's leaning towards Russia, and he calls for an immediate ceasefire in the ongoing war. The Alaska summit, no agreement, and certainly no ceasefire. In fact, Vladimir Putin authorized even heavier bombing in Ukraine, to which Mr. Trump went neutral again. So we've not made a whole lot of progress in the 8 or 9 months since inauguration and when this video lecture was recorded.
Well, the biggest progress is that the Russian economy is terrible right now. It's, as you know, it's crashing. And that, frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army. It's pretty amazing. You know, this is a war that should have ended in 3 days, 4 days. People said it was going to be very quick, and you got to hand it to the Ukrainian soldiers and everybody involved. It's still going on, and that's not a good thing for Russia. This was supposed to be quick, and so, you know, Russia doesn't look very distinguished, having taken 3.5 years now, right? It's about 3.5 years of very hard fighting, and it looks like it's not going to end for a long time.
Wars begin and end for very simple reasons. It's frankly not that complicated. They start when two parties disagree on relative power. One of them thinks it can conquer the other disagrees. The war turns into a stalemate. Wars end when parties agree on relative power. Think about our experience in Vietnam. We were absolutely certain in the early 1960s that we're going to win this war. We are so much more powerful than the North Vietnamese. The war ends in 1973 when we realize we can't beat them. This is a never-ending war. Here in this location in Southeast Asia, we're not a dominant power. They're equal to us on the battlefield, and so we signed an agreement. The same can be said for Israel and Lebanon, 1982 to 1985. There's a realization in Tel Aviv that we're just not going to win this war on our terms. So the question becomes for foreign policy, what can we do to convince Russia that it doesn't have the power to win this war? That's where the debate should be. Not over who's responsible for starting it, not on who's responsible for ending it, not even on territorial exchanges. Rather, how do we convince Moscow, you're not going to win this war, you might as well stop fighting? Thank you as always for being in this lecture series. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Thank you for your support and for your participation.